Hey, what's going on guys? Just like I promised in my previous video, today we're going to be comparing the FX-8350 to the Phenom 2 X61090T. This is something that I've always been curious about, since a lot of people claimed that FX CPUs were a downgrade and didn't really perform any better than Phenom 2. Now yes, Bulldozer was indeed terrible, but with the release of Piledriver, AMD fixed plenty of issues that the first generation of FX CPUs had, yet I'm guessing since Bulldozer left a bad taste in everyone's mouth, many still hated Piledriver as well. I was one of the few people who thought otherwise, and I would always get comments on my FX related videos talking about how better Phenom 2 CPUs are even compared to Piledriver. Funny enough, I would also get quite a few people saying that they noticed a substantial performance uplift when jumping from the 6-core Phenom to the FX-8350, which had me even more confused. So what I decided to do was just get a 6-core Phenom 2 CPU myself and compare it to my FX-8350 in a variety of software and games at stock, clock for clock, and overclocked configurations to see how they stack up compared to each other. Let's get right into it. The specs are going to be exactly the same for both of these CPUs. We're going to be using a Gigabyte 990 FXA UD3 Revision 4 motherboard, a Zalman CNPS 14X CPU cooler, 8GB of DDR3 1600MHz memory, an MSI GTX 970 with an overclock of 125MHz on both core and memory clocks, and a 700-watt FSP Hydro power supply. Please do keep in mind that none of the titles that we are going to be testing today benefit from more than 8GB of RAM, maybe with the exception of Battlefield 5, and all the games were tested using lowest settings at a resolution of 1600 by 900 to reduce any GPU bottlenecks. Alright, so let's begin with the out-of-the-box configurations, and just before we get into performance numbers, let's quickly check the clock speeds of both processors. Running single and multi-threaded tests using Cinebench R15, we can see that both CPUs are reaching advertised clock speeds and that all the other frequencies such as RAM, Northbridge, as well as Hypertransport are correct. Using Intel Burn Test, both CPUs are running very cool, though the 8-core FX processor is nearly 10 degrees Celsius hotter at stock voltages. Jumping into benchmarks, let's begin with Cinebench R15, and here we can see that the FX processor is pulling ahead the 6-core Phenom in both single and multi-threaded tests by 9 and 33% respectively. Next, we have Blender, and using the BMW benchmark, the FX processor manages to render the scene 26% faster than Phenom. Rendering the classroom scene, the 8-core FX pulls ahead even further, finishing the render almost half an hour faster, which is a massive increase of 38%. Next up, we have Corona, which the Phenom processor refused to run since it doesn't have the necessary instructions. The FX-8350, on the other hand, didn't have such issues as it does support SSE 4.1 alongside many other important instructions and got the scene rendered in 5 minutes and 58 seconds. Now, instruction sets can be emulated, but apparently doing so will impact performance, and it's not something that can be done with each software and games, so I decided that it was not worth it. I'm definitely not an expert though, and in case you have any experience with instruction emulation, please feel free to share it in the comment section down below. Moving on to gaming benchmarks, let's begin with GTA 5, and here we can see that the FX processor is performing better by around 10 to 20 FPS depending on the situation. Frame times are also significantly better on the 8-core FX, which is especially noticeable when driving through this city. Next, we have Watch Dogs 2, which is a game that scales better with cores, and once again we can see that the FX processor is able to stay above 50 FPS most of the time, unlike the 6-core Phenom that frequently dropped to 30 frames per second. Next up, we have Battlefield 3, which is a title that got released the same month Bulldozer CPUs were launched, and here we have a similar story. The FX-8350 is performing at least 20 frames better compared to Phenom. To be honest, I don't see a point of going through every single game that I have at stock configurations, cause so far the results are basically identical. The 8-core FX processor is better at stock than Phenom 2, so instead of wasting our time here, let's just move on to the clock for clock results. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to overclock these CPUs exactly the same, so I tried my best to get them as close to each other as I could possibly can. I got the Phenom 2 overclocked to 4.08 GHz using 1.55 volts, with the North Bridge and Hypertransport set to 2550 MHz and the RAM pushed up to 1700 MHz. With the FX processor, I was able to hit 4.088 GHz using 1.325 volts, with the North Bridge and Hypertransport set to 2430 MHz and the RAM overclocked to 1768 MHz. Like I mentioned, this is as close as it gets, and to be fair, even if I could set them exactly the same, I don't think it would make much of a difference. Comparing these CPUs clock for clock in Cinebench R15, we can now see that not only the Phenom processor has closed the gap in terms of multi-threaded performance, but it's also beating the FX-8350 at single core by 8% due to the IPC disadvantage of FX processors. Next up, we have Blender, and while the Phenom processor got a pretty good performance uplift over stock, it still wasn't enough to beat the FX-8350 in both classroom and BMW benchmarks. Moving on to GTA 5, we can see that the 6-core Phenom is now only around 5 to 10 FPS behind the FX processor, although it is worth mentioning that the FX-8350 still has slightly better frame times. Next, we have Watch Dogs 2, and the Phenom processor is now only performing around 5 to 7 FPS worse compared to FX. Next up, we have Battlefield 3, and to my surprise, here the Phenom processor is performing a few FPS better than the FX-8350, presumably due to slightly better single-core performance. Moving on, we have Crysis 3, where the FX-8350 beats the Phenom processor by around 5 to 10 FPS, while also delivering slightly more consistent frame times.
Whatever they found, it's dead now.
How far to 34th Street Station?
Couple of clicks. We'll have to get around the kill zone first.
Next, we have The Witcher 3, and depending on the area, the difference in frame rates can be from 5 and up to 20 FPS in favor of the FX processor.
8 at the Kingfisher, you're sorted for at least.
Running Intel burn test, we can see that the FX processor does not run as hot as it did at stock. In fact, now it runs 17 degrees Celsius cooler than Phenom 2, since it does not require a lot of voltage for a 4.1 GHz overclock, meaning that it also consumes less power. I think that is enough clock for clock testing, since it is pretty much obvious that at the same frequency the Phenom processor is pretty close, but not close enough to beat the FX-8350, so let's just move on to the final comparison that we're mostly going to focus on, which is going to be with both CPUs overclocked to their limits. Now, in clock for clock testing, the Phenom processor was already maxed out, so the overclock is going to be exactly the same for it, since there's basically no more room left to push it any further. The FX processor though still had plenty of headroom, and I managed to push it to 4.582 GHz using 1.5 volts, with the North Bridge and Hypertransport set to 2585 MHz, and the RAM overclocked to 2193 MHz. Looking at Cinebench R15 results, we can see that the FX processor has now regained the single-core lead by 3% and is also pulling further ahead in multi-core test by 19%. Next, we have Blender, and using the BMW benchmark, the FX-8350 manages to render the scene 19% faster than Phenom. Using the classroom scene, the FX processor pulls ahead once again, finishing it almost 18 minutes faster, which is a 30% uplift. By the way, I know I didn't include a lot of software tests, though the FX-8350 should have a similar performance lead, whether you're using Sony Vegas, Adobe Premiere, Handbrake, etc. Moving on to gaming results, we have GTA 5, and here the FX-8350 is beating Phenom 2 by around 5 to 15 frames per second. Next, we have Watch Dogs 2, where the FX CPU also takes the lead, performing up to 15 FPS better than the 6-core Phenom processor. Next up, we have Battlefield 3, and the 8-core FX is pulling ahead once again, outperforming the 6-core Phenom by around 5 to 10 frames, though to be fair, this is not the kind of situation where you would notice a difference.
Да, сегодня несколько человек узнает о том, что мы сделали для человечества.
Next on the list is Crysis 3, and unsurprisingly the FX-8350 takes the lead here as well, beating the 6-core Phenom processor by around 15 to 20 FPS.
Whatever they found, it's dead now.
How far to 34th Street Station?
Couple of clicks. We'll have to get around the kill zone first.
Witcher 3 isn't much different. The FX-8350 is ahead by at least 15 and up to 25 frames per second.
8 at the Kingfisher, you're sorted for at least 2 days.
The thinking customer will see right away the best deal for some.
Any news from the Phenom?
Moving on, we have the Division, and using the built-in benchmark, we can see that the frame rate is pretty similar since we're mostly GPU bound here, but even then, the 8-core FX runs noticeably more stable.
Hold up! I'm out for a sec!
Next up, we have PUBG, where the FX-8350 is performing around 10 to 12 FPS better, and while that may not seem like a lot, it will definitely come in handy in demanding locations. Next, we have Need for Speed 2015, and all the same can be seen here, the FX processor is beating Phenom 2 by around 10 frames per second. Next on the list is Battlefield 5, and while both processors are having a hard time maintaining a stable frame time, the game still runs noticeably better on the 8-core FX CPU, thanks to a roughly 20 FPS advantage as well as quite a bit more consistent frame times. For the last game, I decided to include Apex Legends just to show you how frustrating lack of instructions on the 6-core Phenom can actually be. The FX CPU, on the other hand, doesn't have any issues running Apex Legends and is able to stay above 100 frames most of the time. I've been told by a couple of people in my previous video that the Phenom processor is capable of running Apex Legends via instruction emulation, though unfortunately none of them could verify their claims, and according to many articles, the only way to play Apex Legends on a Phenom processor is by just simply upgrading it to an FX CPU. In case you know a fix to this problem though, or can confirm that there is no way of resolving it, please be sure to let me know in the comment section down below. Looking at thermal performance, we can see that when overclocked to nearly 4.6 GHz using 1.5 volts, the FX processor is running 9 degrees Celsius hotter than a maxed out Phenom 2 X6 1090T, though I must say that a 4.5 GHz overclock requires only around 1.45 volts. With that voltage, there should be no temperature difference between the Phenom and the FX processor, and the FX-8350 should also be consuming slightly less power thanks to the lower voltages. To be honest, I believe that even at 4.6 GHz using 1.5 volts, the FX CPU should not be consuming more power than a 6-core Phenom 2 at 4.1 GHz using 1.55 volts, though unfortunately I cannot really confirm that claim at this point. Finally, I'd like to talk about an issue that I've noticed while I was using the Phenom processor, which is laggy video playback that some videos have on YouTube. As an example, I decided to use this video from Chris Fix, and running it at 1080p 60 FPS, the video had buffering issues for some reason, no matter whether the CPU was overclocked or not. There were plenty of videos that did not have such a problem while running at 1080p 60 FPS, but even then they were kind of choppy, which by the way wasn't the case with the FX-8350. Just out of curiosity, I decided to try using Microsoft Edge to see if the same issue persisted, and surprisingly, both problems were gone. I'm not entirely sure what's going on here, so in case you have a Phenom 2 processor and can share your video playback experience on YouTube using Chrome and a couple of other browsers, I would really appreciate that. So, was the FX-8350 a downgrade? Definitely not. Sure, it was a small step back in terms of IPC, but I'd say a decent step forward in everything else. You got more instructions, a noticeable performance uplift, not to mention the MSRP of Piledriver was much lower at launch. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm in no way trying to hate on Phenom 2 cause it was great back when it got released. I just don't understand why I've heard so many people and seen so many comments mention how even Piledriver was not worth the upgrade over Phenom 2. Many claimed that Piledriver CPUs ran hotter, consumed more power, and did not really perform any better. Even I was convinced that the 8-core FX was worse, though only after using the 6-core Phenom 2 processor have I learned that it was quite the opposite. Now yes, at stock the FX-8350 does run slightly hotter, which by the way is due to unnecessarily high stock voltages, but it does perform significantly better and according to different articles, does not consume much more power than Phenom 2. I thought maybe clock for clock the 6-core Phenom processor would be able to outperform the FX-8350, but that also didn't happen. Sure, it got a slightly better single-core result in Cinebench R15, but that was it. It still got mostly beaten by the FX processor that ran significantly cooler, mind you, since it does not require as much voltage as Phenom 2 does for the same clock speed. Alright, I'm gonna wrap it up. Sorry for such a long video, but this is as short as it gets. Have you upgraded from a Phenom 2 CPU to an FX1, and if so, what was your experience? Let me know in the comment section down below. Also, don't forget to turn on the notifications since I'm currently testing the FX-6300, which is what we're going to be looking at next. By the way, I have the box right over here. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. Feel free to check out more videos on my channel. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe for more content, and I'll see y'all in the next one.